Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So 6 weeks into filming videos for YouTube and I have just discovered that my tripod can extend to here, to standing height, rather than having to sit down for all of my videos. So I'm trying it out. I'm seeing if this works for me. I don't know. It might be a bit of a continuity disaster because I know how often I stumble over my words and have to like cut things sneakily so that hopefully you don't notice how many takes I've had to take to do a sentence like that, right there. I have a feeling that if I'm walking around all of the time that maybe that's going to be a bit of a disaster, but fingers crossed it's not going to be terrible. And also, doing this, you can see what I'm wearing! Yay! Also, I am filming this on Thursday the 2nd of July, which means that Hamilton is coming tomorrow to Disney+, and I am so excited. Please let me know if you're also excited, if you've watched it. I don't know when this is going up. This might be going up either Friday or Sunday, so if you have seen it, let me know what you think. I'm so giddy. I am so giddy. I wrote my master's dissertation partially on Hamilton, so as you can imagine, I'm just like, just to have the opportunity to see that original cast for the first time. Oh, chef's kiss, love it. But I'm not here to talk about that with you today. I'm here to talk about the books that I read in the second half of June. June's been a pretty good reading month for me. I feel like I kind of tailed off towards the end of it because I was doing like quite a lot of filming, which you'll hopefully see the results of in the next week or so. But no, I'm wanting to get right back into it. I've also decided to participate in Middle March Along, which is being hosted by Claire Fenby, where we are reading Middlemarch by George Eliot. It's a classic that I have always wanted to get to. But yes, enough rambling, let's get into the books that I read in the second half of June. So as I said in the part 1 June wrap up, I have been really in the mood for Greek myth retellings. I reread The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller and absolutely adored it. So I was just really in that mood. I'm still in that mood for Greek myth retellings, and with that in mind I picked up The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, which is also a Trojan War retelling. This in particular tells the story of Briseis, who was Achilles' prize after the Greek army ransacked her city, and basically tells Briseis' story of living with the Greek army and living with Achilles and Patroclus during the end of the Trojan War. Right off the bat, something that I think is quite distinctive about the writing style of Silence of the Girls is that it has a much more colloquial, more contemporary sound to it. It is not at any point trying to sound mythical or fairy tale-like, trying to create that illusion that you are just reading another ancient Greek myth. There is, for example, a lot of modern slang peppered throughout this book, which I have a feeling that quite a lot of people will not really like and engage with, and it will maybe take people out to see the anachronistic language that is being used in here. There are a lot of instances, for example, where like Achilles will say, "Yep, she'll do, lads," and everybody laughs, and it's, you know, the kind of language that you know they wouldn't have said back then. So I can understand why people wouldn't really like it. It didn't bother me too much, to be honest, but I can see why other people would kind of be a bit about it. I think the main commentary that Pat Barker is trying to get across with this book is the way in which history, often being told by the perspectives of men, really leave women's experiences out, and often particularly will leave out the more unsavoury aspects of the experience of being a woman, especially in a war setting. For example, in the Iliad by Homer, Agamemnon is insistent that he never touched Briseis when he took her away from Achilles. But how do we know that that's true? How do we know that that is not just Agamemnon spinning a story about how he's treated Briseis well? When unfortunately we do know full well what happened to a lot of women when they were captured by opposing armies. Pat Barker is really trying to emphasise how the histories that tend to survive are usually the ones that we prefer to hear rather than what the reality might have actually been. However, for saying that, there were a few things that kind of rubbed me up the wrong way with Silence of the Girls. Firstly, it probably didn't help that I read this hot off of reading The Song of Achilles, because I felt so betrayed by Achilles in this. I just kept thinking, no, the Achilles that I know would never do such a thing. And Pat Barker is kind of wishy-washy on the relationship between Patroclus and Achilles as to whether or not they were lovers. There's a lot of, oh, it might have happened, but I don't know, I never saw. Whereas in my little shipper heart, I feel like it had to happen. Please, 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 please. And also for me, for the amount of emphasis that Pat Barker is wanting to put on the stories of the women, I felt like aside from Bryce's, the story of the women of the Trojan War was really lacking in this book, actually. I wanted to hear more from these other captured women who were living in the Greek army's compounds. There is a moment at the end where we start to hear a little bit more of what happened to these women after the fact, but it kind of felt as if Pat Barker had remembered, oh yeah, I was meant to be writing about the silence of the girls, and I've only really been focusing on one girl. Another thing that kind of rubbed me up the wrong way with this is that, considering this is a story that is meant to be from the women's point of view, as soon as we get to like part 2 of this story, we start to see the story of the Trojan War from the perspective of Achilles, and that just seemed a little bit at odds with what the book was trying to do. Why are we seeing this story from Achilles' point of view? What does that bring to the whole point of this book? If we are meant to be focusing on the silent women of the Trojan War, why are we focusing on this man who has had so much time already dedicated to him? Not that his insight wasn't interesting at all, but it just felt at odds with the premise for me. So yeah, personally for me, it's not my favourite ancient Greek myth retelling. I'd probably put it at a 3-star. I would still recommend that you read this, but not my favourite. The next book I have to talk to you about is The Farm by Joanne Ramos. This is set in our own modern world with a bit of a twist, in which women who need a little bit of extra income can go to this institution in which they are basically baby makers for rich clients. They stay at this institution for the duration of their pregnancy and a little bit afterwards. They are treated very well. They are put on like very strict exercise and diet regimes, but have at the same time a lot of freedoms restricted to them because they have to be these controlled baby machines. It is a book that talks a lot about the commodification of women's bodies and the commodification of babies and pregnancy. There is a particular line that really stuck with me when this institution is being introduced about this concept of a client having a 3-and-3, a deal in which they have paid to have 3 babies in 3 years, as if it's like a buy one get one free kind of deal, and it was just such a creepy line to read. And I think the main emphasis to be taken away from this is the way in which when we commodify anything in this sort of way, that it is vulnerable people who are most often impacted by these systems, and how that is often divided by class and racial lines. That if you are a person who is not very privileged inherently in your society, that you may have to make the choice to go to one of these institutions to make money, but how much of that is actually a choice for you? It's a book with a very interesting concept, and I know a lot of people have been picking this up and reading it recently, but for me, whilst I found the concept really interesting, and whilst I think Joanne Ramos really builds this creepy, sinister atmosphere, like in a line she can switch a conversation from being kind of friendly and engaging to suddenly being so sinister. I did feel like some of the execution let this book down for me, particularly in terms of pace and characters. I just found this book to be a little bit too slow for me. It took a good like 50-60 pages for the concept to really kick in, and then after it did kick in, I just found that I didn't find any of these characters particularly engaging. I found them very bland, and that is a personal preference for me. It's all well and good to have an interesting concept with a book, but I really need to care about these characters, whether or not they are good or bad people. They just need to be interesting to me. So that unfortunately let it down, but I can see a lot of people enjoying this. So I wouldn't say don't check this out. It might definitely be for you. The next book I have to talk to you about is Magna Carta by Dan Jones. So on the 15th of June, it was the 805th anniversary of Magna Carta, the charter that was drawn up by King John and his barons to kind of act as a peace treaty, because they were, for lack of a better word, bickering. Fighting. And Magna Carta is a very famous charter which is referenced so often by people, but for how often it is referenced, Magna Carta was an unsuccessful charter put in place to put a check on the king's authority and his power over his barons, and yet it was broken within 6 weeks of being signed, and yet it has had this ongoing legacy in English history and in world history, it is invoked by so many people. Magna Carta has endured in the public's consciousness because of the way that it has been reappropriated and reused in the 16th century, in the 17th century, and the 18th century, and how it is used and invoked today. Particularly, Magna Carta was referenced in the 17th century during the English Civil War, being used as a precedent for when nobles put a check on the king's power, and then was again used in the 18th century during the American Revolutionary War when they were fighting against King George III. And that's really what this particular book goes into. It goes into the history surrounding Magna Carta, the lead up and the eventual signing of it, but then really delves into the afterlife of Magna Carta. To be honest, as I've said before, this is a period of history that I am not the most well versed in, so this was a very, very nice, handy introduction. It also comes with the charter itself right at the back with a Latin translation, I do believe. Yeah, it has a Latin translation and then the English on the other side. So it's like a very nice compact introduction to Magna Carta and how the charter has been used and misused throughout history. I actually really enjoyed this much more than I thought I would, because Dan Jones is like quite a funny, quippy writer. It was a topic that I thought was going to be so dry and humorless, but I think because he himself is so witty, a lot of his deadpan humour really came through in this. So if you are at all interested in Magna Carta, then yeah, this is a very good introduction for it. Gonna take a little bit of a break from the big, dense books to talk about this bundle of joy that I picked up recently. This is The Buildings That Made London by David Long and Josie Shenoy. This is a beautiful, like, children's illustrated book of all of the buildings that have had a big historic impact on London and the making of London. Basically, this purchase came about because I was creating a little online list of books that I really want to buy for my niece, who is like 2 years old, and obviously a lot of the books that I want to buy for her are a bit old for her, like a good 5-6 years too old for her. I just don't want to be reading board books anymore, but I understand she's too young for anything else. And the books, the pretty illustrated books that I want to get for her, she will just rip immediately. But I saw this and I couldn't leave this. It's just so beautiful. Like the illustrations are stunning, and it's just a really lovely introduction to London. I think, you know, whenever she goes to London for the first time, I'll probably give her this as an introduction to London. Got 10 Downing Street, Hampton Court Palace. This is one of my favourite spreads of Hampton Court Palace, and it's got beautiful illustrations, but also really informative, accessible writing about these buildings and the history surrounding them. Palm House. There is a big spread for Buckingham Palace. So it starts off with just Buckingham House, and then the expansion into Buckingham Palace. Like, how stunning is that? So yeah, if you've got a little person in your life, or you are a big kid like me, then yeah, I definitely recommend this, because this is just a thing of beauty. And then back onto my ancient Greek myth kick, I read Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey this month. Now, I had read the Odyssey before in a prose translation for school. I read it for my A-levels, but I was really, really keen to read Emily Wilson's because this is the first published translation written by a woman. And I'd heard a lot of talk about how Emily Wilson really brought out the gendered translations in previous editions to this, particularly when men have been translating discussions around Helen of Troy and Circe and Penelope and Calypso and all these other women in the Odyssey. And I really, really enjoyed this translation of the Odyssey. I was really glad to get back into this world, and I've never actually read a verse translation of the Odyssey. As I said, the one that I read for school was a prose translation. So I loved this. I absolutely loved this. This is written in iambic pentameter, which is not quite the Homeric, what's the word? Dactylic hexameter. Yay, did I say it right? But iambic pentameter is much easier for a modern English audience to read, and I think it was definitely the right choice. But I actually think that this is a really good introduction to the Odyssey for new readers. It has a much more modern, colloquial, contemporary kind of feel to it and translation. The verse is very clean and straightforward. It's not kind of peppered with lots of flowery language that I think other verse translations had before. So I feel like you could very easily just jump into this and get what's going on. You might have to do a little bit of a Google search for a couple of characters and to kind of understand who's being referenced, but I think, yeah, it's a good introduction. I really felt like I was back in lower sixth form studying the Odyssey, because all I kept thinking about was the references to hospitality. The main theme of this is treating guests well and being a hospitable host, but also being a good guest. And there are repeated instances throughout the Odyssey where that rule of hospitality are broken or upheld, and the reaction to that and how the gods react. Something also that I picked up on, which I don't think I did when I read this at age 17, is how emotion is really strongly felt by characters. People cry a lot in the Odyssey, and it's absolutely fine, and it's like healthy and good to show your emotion, particularly like Odysseus. The first time that we see Odysseus in the text, he is crying on a beach, and it's not seen as a weakness in him. It is seen as like very natural that, yes, of course, you have not seen your wife for like 17 years. Of course, you are going to be very upset about this. And crying and showing your emotions in this story are ways of bonding with other people. People aren't looked down upon for crying. There isn't like this, men must be tough and hold their emotions in. Like, none of that in here. There's toxic masculinity, surely, in the Odyssey, but it's not in the expressing of your emotions, which is quite nice. And then the last thing that I have to talk to you about today is Eleanor of Aquitaine by Alison Weir. As the title suggests, this is about Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the wife of Henry II of England, though she was also married to King Louis VII of France before she married Henry II. It's always quite an entertaining story about how Eleanor was married to Louis VII of France, and then he kind of put her aside and divorced her because she wasn't able to give him sons, and then she marries Henry II and then has a bunch of boys. I don't know, it's a historical irony that I always just really, really enjoy. And yeah, this just goes into the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had a very, very eventful life. She went on crusade. She had very turbulent relationships with both of her husbands. She was imprisoned by Henry II after she rebelled against him. She lived a grand, long life. Though I will say for myself personally, and this is just a personal like enjoyment factor, I did enjoy much more the beginning half of this biography than I did the later half of her life, and that's just based on what happened rather than because the writing was not very good or anything like that. There is a lot of discussion in here about Henry II and his relationship, particularly to the religious orders and to the church, and that wasn't always the most interesting thing to read about for me. I don't know why, which of course was a very turbulent relationship in this time period, because this is the era of Thomas Becket and what happened to him. This is very interesting in exploring the lack of evidence, particularly for Eleanor. There are so many instances where we just do not have evidence for what she was doing, and it's like, she was the Queen of England. How do we not know what she was doing? How can chroniclers have just not talked about her? But this is a recurring thing with women in history. Even very, very prominent women are often, they just don't think to talk about the women. And that doesn't mean that they weren't engaged or involved. They're just left out because, who cares about women? Another thing that was really interesting for me with this book, particularly when we were talking about Thomas Becket or Henry II or Richard I, is the way in which people are remembered, particularly after they've died, and how we kind of change our memories of figures. The way in which these characters are remembered fondly, even though during their lifetime they were very turbulent, very controversial figures, we remember them as much greater than perhaps they actually were. And how we kind of gloss over these more difficult, ambiguous aspects of their lives in order to satisfy a more broad narrative of this person as being a great man or a great woman. But how soon after the death this can occur. Like I say, I always really enjoy Alison Weir as a writer, though I don't know necessarily if this is my favourite biography of her, and that's purely based on the actual events rather than her writing it all. I actually just finished reading a biography of Empress Matilda. Oh my god, I am so excited about this biography and just this life of Empress Matilda. It's a life that really frustrates me, just the whole story frustrates me, but oh, what an interesting woman. be prepared because I'm going to gush so much about this biography. So yeah, that's your little preview for the July wrap up. Is I found a new favourite historical figure in Empress Matilda, so do your homework if you want to. So yes, that is everything that I read in the second half of June. Let me know what you thought about some of these books and my review of them. Let me know what you felt about the standing around, jumping around in this video. I actually quite enjoyed it much more than sitting down. I always feel kind of constricted when I'm sat down, so I quite like the freedom, but we'll see if I keep this up. I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to speaking to you again really, really soon. Thank you. Bye.